I met up with an old friend last week. He's a senior engineer, has spent 30 years designing critical infrastructure.
It's heavy stuff.
The heavy stuff, exactly. Bridges, tunnels, everything that keeps civilization from, falling apart.
Right.
And he's usually the most grounded person I know, just completely obsessed with load-bearing ratios and material fatigue. But this time he looked haunted.
Haunted, that's a strong word.
It is. He told me he's taking early retirement, just walking away right at the peak of his career.
Wow.
And when I asked him why, I was expecting, the usual complaints about stress or the hours. But he didn't say anything at first. He just slid his phone across the table.
And what was on it?
An internal memo. It was a reprimand from HR.
For what?
His offense. He had rejected a subcontractor. Now, this company had a history of safety failures.
Okay, that seems like a good reason to reject them.
You'd think so, but
Yeah.
they also had a perfect social compliance score.
I see where this is going.
He just looked at me, and his voice was barely a whisper. He said, "I can argue with a budget committee. I can argue with an architect. But I can't argue with a department that treats physics like it's just another bias to be corrected."
Yeah, it is a chilling line. Physics as a bias.
It is. He described this workplace where suddenly the ability to do the math was becoming secondary. It was less important than being able to recite the correct political slogans.
And the look in his eyes? You said it was resignation?
It wasn't just burnout, it was terror. The terror of a man who understands the math, watching the safety margins just evaporate in real time.
And that's when you realized.
That's when I realized the door plug blowing off that Alaska Airlines flight wasn't some freak accident. It felt more like a warning shot.
Okay.
A symptom of a system that has decided reality is, negotiable.
That story it's more than just an anecdote, isn't it? It's a symptom of a really profound systemic threat.
How so?
Well, when the objective, completely non-negotiable laws of physics, the very foundation of engineering competence, are just, pushed aside.
Relegated to a preference.
Exactly. Treated like a preference or some political opinion that you can correct or balance out, then the structural integrity of our entire civilization is directly endangered. We absolutely rely on experts who are loyal to reality, not to ideology.
And that's the core of it, right? My friend wasn't just losing a professional argument, he was losing a fight against entropy itself, being forced to accept a compromise with, objective failure.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive.
Yes, we are going beyond the anecdotes today to really investigate the specific actionable mechanisms that cause this ideological adherence to systematically displace objective, demonstrable standards.
We have to look at this from every angle. We need to investigate how these ubiquitous corporate frameworks, things like DEI and ESG, are practically impacting critical infrastructure.
Not just in theory.
Not in theory at all, where the rubber meets the road. And then we have to zoom in on the professionals themselves. We have to examine the immense psychological pressure they face to conform and the real costs of their silence.
And finally, you can't ignore the historical echoes. We have to analyze the parallels, like the catastrophic Soviet experiment with Lysenkoism, to really understand the inevitable destructive consequences of choosing dogma over competence.
And what happens when a state tries to negotiate with biology or physics? It's an investigation that carries enormous stakes, really.
We're basically asking how fragile our modern professional meritocracy is when it's faced with the demands of a kind of purity culture.
And what happens when that fragility threatens the safety, the reliability, and ultimately the durability of the systems that support modern life?
Okay, let's unpack this. We should begin with Section 1, examining how these ideological frameworks, specifically DEI and ESG, might be actively eroding operational safety.
Because the worry here, as you said, is that initiatives designed for social good are having these unintended, potentially catastrophic consequences in fields where mistakes are lethal.
Exactly.
And that concern is now front and center, particularly in these safety-critical sectors. We're seeing it reflected in some very stark public commentary.
You're talking about Elon Musk.
I am. He's repeatedly issued a very strong warning, claiming that DEI policies will persist. He even twisted the acronym to DIE, which is obviously very provocative.
And he said this policy will continue until what?
Until, and I'm quoting here, an airplane crashing and killing hundreds of people forces an institutional change in priority.
That is an apocalyptic prediction.
Yeah.
But it does lay bare that tension you mentioned, doesn't it? The perceived conflict between maintaining absolute rigorous performance standards
And prioritizing diversity criteria in these critical roles. When you're talking about aviation, where every single maintenance check, every procedure, every pilot's decision has to be perfect.
Or the military, for that matter.
Or the military, where lives and strategic capability depend on absolute professional excellence. The margin for error that gets introduced by compromising on merit is just zero. It has to be.
So the fear is pretty fundamental then. If you dilute the criteria for entry or promotion, even slightly, by elevating demographic factors above demonstrable qualifications,
you inject systemic risk right into the core of the operation. So these frameworks, which are aiming for social improvement, can become, well, Trojan horses for operational instability.
Prioritizing optics over objective, measurable skill.
Especially in those critical positions.
And to really grasp this mechanism, we have to scrutinize the frameworks themselves, especially ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics. They've become the gold standard for corporate reputation.
Right, but we have some critiques from an experienced environmental engineer who calls these metrics, and this is a great phrase, cleverly crafted illusions.
Illusions, not genuine indicators of sustainability or ethical practice. The label looks good.
But the underlying reality is often manipulated. We need to dissect that critique because it speaks directly to how these institutional efforts can prioritize looking good over actually being good.
So let's start with the E, environmental.
Okay, so the engineer argues that the obsession with easily quantifiable targets, things like reducing carbon emissions, often ends up being a sophisticated way to just obscure pollution or damage in other areas.
Right. They say these metrics can obfuscate pollution in other areas, so things like resource depletion, biodiversity loss, or the broader ecosystem impact.
Give us an example.
Okay, think about a massive manufacturing company. It's operating in a region that's facing severe water scarcity. They might heavily invest in, say, solar power on their roof and get an excellent ESG rating for low carbon emissions.
Which looks great on the annual report.
It looks fantastic. But if that same company is simultaneously depleting the local water table, leaving the community dry, their overall environmental impact is hugely negative.
But their ESG score is high.
Exactly. The narrowly defined metric allows them to game the system. It's the definition of selective reporting, a kind of strategic blindness.
The company gets rewarded for addressing the public's main concern, which is carbon, while quietly increasing harm in these less visible areas. It's just a tick box exercise, not a genuine move toward holistic sustainability.
And then you move to the social component. This ties directly into DEI and the social compliance scores, like the one that got my engineer friend reprimanded.
And the critique here centers on tokenism, on superficial metrics.
Right. We have to ask, do impressive gender diversity statistics or racial representation numbers at the junior level actually translate to genuine equal pay?
Or equal opportunity for promotion? Or true cultural transformation? Often the answer is no.
No. These initiatives can be used for what's called superficial tokenism. The company prominently features diverse individuals in, public-facing roles or marketing materials.
But fails to address the deeper systemic issues. Things like the workplace culture, harassment, or even the exclusion of those diverse hires for the most challenging, high-stakes operational roles.
It's the difference between just checking a box on a hiring quota versus actually reforming the underlying cultural policies that ensure people stay and thrive because they feel valued for their competence.
And if you don't do that, the superficial change just masks the deeper cultural rot. The company looks inclusive on the outside, but internally it's suffering from the same old issues, only now with, added resentment.
And that brings us to G governance. Ostensibly, this pillar is there to ensure a strong board, transparency, anti-corruption policies. They look great on paper.
But the engineer's skepticism remains. Are these policies truly effective, or are they just window dressing?
If the underlying corporate culture is still driven by cronyism or fear of reprisal or outright manipulation, then all these complex, legally mandated anti-corruption policies become performative.
A way to satisfy institutional investors without ensuring any real ethical enforcement or operational rigor.
Which brings us right back to that core conflict between DEI principles and professional standards, the very standards that underpin operational safety in engineering.
The fear isn't that diversity is inherently bad. Of course not. The fear is that when merit is compromised, performance suffers across the board.
And in critical sectors, that leads to fatalities or catastrophic infrastructure failures.
So let's detail the specific concerns about how prioritizing demographic criteria over technical mastery really compromises a meritocracy.
Okay. The primary concern is that a system focused on quotas, well, it inevitably introduces a bias against merit.
So individuals might be promoted or hired based predominantly on demographic factors or these internal metrics like social compliance,
Instead of on demonstrable qualifications, past safety records, or objective professional excellence.
and that fear, whether it's entirely validated in every case or not, leads to intense resentment among employees who feel like they're competing on an uneven, ideologically predetermined playing field.
And that resentment, in turn, just severely undermines the credibility of the entire initiative inside the organization.
It creates a devastating erosion of trust in the evaluation process itself. I mean, if there's even a perception that underperforming employees might be retained, or worse, promoted just to meet a quota,
Then confidence in the fairness and rigor of the entire evaluation process just collapses.
absolutely. Think about the mindset of a highly competent engineer, like your friend. If he knows that the person reviewing his load calculations or the subcontractor doing the welding is retained not because of a proven track record of competence, but because of demographic requirements,
His confidence in the safety margin of his final design plummets.
and his motivation to excel is severely diminished, he starts to realize he's now shouldering the risk of others' mandated incompetence.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that stakeholders have to demand extreme vigilance.
We need transparency, we need verification, and a move beyond these isolated, publicly touted achievements to focus on the holistic impact of a company's operations.
Because if the systems that are supposed to ensure rigor, whether it's ESG reporting or internal hiring, if they lack that transparency and objective accountability, the erosion of standards will continue.
And the warnings of systemic failure, however dramatic they sound, will eventually be validated by future accidents. That's a crucial point, because the systems may demand compliance, but what about the people inside those systems?
Right. Why do highly competent, rational professionals who see the dangers, who see these manipulated metrics and compromised standards, why do they stay silent?
Why aren't more people speaking up and demanding a return to merit?
And that takes us into the institutional pressure cooker, which is the focus of Section 2, the sociology of conformity and the professional brain drain.
This is where we move the camera inside the organization. We're focusing now on the psychological environment where professionals face this immense pressure to align with organizational ideology.
Even if they internally disagree or even believe that ideology is leading to objective harm.
And to understand this silence, we really have to look at measurable human psychology. We need to move away from subjective workplace arguments and look at the data.
There's a fascinating study on this, wasn't there, on social conformity under public scrutiny in a hierarchical setting.
There was, and it gives us a perfect window into why the engineer in your anecdote felt he couldn't argue with HR.
So tell us about the experimental setup. It's a very clean way to isolate the variables of status and visibility.
So the researchers asked participants to rate novel stimuli. In this case, they were abstract fractal images, so something where the rating is pretty subjective.
No right or wrong answer.
Exactly. But the crucial factor was the social interaction. Participants were introduced to a partner who was designated as either superior or inferior in social rank.
And how is that rank determined?
It was supposedly based on their performance on a previous unrelated task. So the hierarchy was manufactured, but the participants believed it was real.
And they were then shown their partner's rating and allowed to adjust their own.
Precisely. And then the study introduced a second critical variable, visibility. Participants operated under two conditions.
Public and private.
A private condition, where their final decisions were anonymous, and a public condition, where their preferences would be publicly known to both the superior and the inferior partners.
So what were the key findings? This is the crucial part.
The results were striking, and they are highly predictive of behavior in corporate and academic hierarchies. Participants were significantly more likely to change their preferences, to conform, to match those of the superior partner, but only when their decisions were publicly known.
So only when they were being watched?
Only when they were being watched. When their decisions were private and anonymous, the conformity effect was much smaller. And critically, conformity to the inferior partner.
It didn't change at all.
It remained unchanged, regardless of whether the decision was public or anonymous.
So that is the key distinction. It's not just simple groupthink or agreeing with the crowd. It's a targeted strategic difference to the consensus that is set by power.
And specifically, when that power is watching and grading your performance, the stakes of disagreement become entirely different.
Yes, the mechanism is status seeking, not truth seeking.
It is. And the researchers took this one step further. They correlated the conformity tendency with established personality traits, which helps us understand the psychological drivers behind it.
And what were those drivers?
They found that the tendency to conform was strongest among those who scored higher in two specific metrics: social dominance orientation, or SDO.
And greater fear of negative evaluation, or FNE.
Right. So let's break those two down. Social dominance orientation, SDO, it essentially measures a preference for group-based hierarchies and inequality. It's the belief that some groups or individuals should naturally be on top.
And fear of negative evaluation, FNE, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's the apprehension, the worry, the distress about what other people think of you.
About being negatively assessed or criticized. In a professional context, this translates to the fear of being labeled a contrarian, a racist, or simply difficult.
So when you combine that psychological drive to respect hierarchy, the SDO, with an intense fear of criticism from that hierarchy, the FNE.
You have the perfect psychological formula for ideological capture.
Absolutely. The research suggests that the primary motivation for publicly conforming to the superior viewpoint is, and I'm quoting, to make better impressions on people of higher social status.
It's not a change in genuine belief. It's a strategic effort to succeed, to survive, and to advance within the hierarchy that holds the power to reward or punish you.
And this explains exactly why an engineer who knows the math is wrong will stay silent if the HR department has superior status in the organizational power structure.
This psychological compulsion, when you translate it into professional environments, academia, engineering firms, government agencies, is what leads to that phenomenon often described as going GALT.
Where the most highly competent people just retreat, they retire early, or they self-censor into functional silence.
That is the direct consequence of a contaminated environment. We see institutions, particularly elite universities and large corporations, becoming dominated by what one observer called a progressive majority ethos.
And this ethos, it doesn't just hold intellectual weight, does it? It exerts physical and moral authority over thought. It creates an environment where any dissent is immediately met with social and professional sanctions.
And this brings us back to the political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, who observed the tyranny of the majority with, well, chilling accuracy.
He noted that the man who goes against the majority faces something far worse than a traditional totalitarian state. He faces, quote, all kinds of unpleasantness and everyday persecution.
And the consequence of this widespread, diffused institutional pressure isn't necessarily jail time. It's a slow, agonizing process of professional and social exclusion.
Tocqueville argued that this causes those who privately think like the dissenting man, but without his courage, retreat into silence as if ashamed of having told the truth.
They see the cost paid by the brave dissenter, and they choose to fade away.
That silent retreat has an absolutely disastrous societal cost. The system is left with a disastrous void in courage.
The highly skilled professionals, the academics, the doctors, the engineers, the lawyers, they become what are often described as timorous people.
More focused on the single goal of just riding out their careers without incident than on upholding objective standards.
They conduct a calculated risk assessment. They realize the cost of speaking up, public shaming, institutional sanction, losing career prospects, or even just being forced into early retirement like your friend, is overwhelmingly higher than the cost of staying silent and watching the standards slowly degrade.
So the professional calculation becomes survival over rigor?
And that, fundamentally, is the moral and intellectual death of the institution. When the best and brightest are paralyzed by fear of status loss, objective rigor becomes impossible to maintain.
As the observation went, a man cannot think straight when his knees are trembling. The institution gets filled with people paralyzed by FNE, and in that state, truth is the first casualty.
That fear of speaking truth to power, especially when power is wielding ideological purity tests, is not a new phenomenon at all. It's historically familiar.
And history offers us a devastating case study of what happens when an entire state chooses dogma over data.
Which leads us seamlessly into Section 3, ideological purity tests and the historical analog of Lysenkoism.
Lysenkoism is. It's one of the darkest chapters in the history of science. It serves as this direct, catastrophic, historical example of institutional capture, leading not just to local failure, but to widespread, systemic national competence collapse. It resulted in famine and the destruction of an entire scientific field.
So Trofim Lysenko's campaign was a Soviet pseudoscientific effort against established genetics and science-based agriculture during the mid-20th century.
And it offers such a powerful analogy because it shows how ideology can become weaponized against reality and how the state will enforce it.
So what were the core claims of this dogma? How did it reject verifiable data for political ideology?
Lysenko fundamentally rejected the accepted science at the time, specifically Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection. He dismissed the gene itself as a bourgeois invention.
A bourgeois invention?
Yes, a capitalist, individualistic concept that focused on inherent traits rather than environmental influence.
And what did he promote instead? He promoted a Marxist genetics, which was essentially a resurrection of Lamarckism, the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics.
So he argued that organisms could be indefinitely and quickly transformed just through environmental changes.
Which aligned perfectly with the Communist Party's political program of creating the new Soviet man and rapidly overpowering nature to achieve some kind of immediate agricultural utopia.
Its ideological confirmation bias elevated to the status of state science.
And this must have led to some truly absurd scientific claims, since he was trying to force nature to adhere to political doctrine.
The claims were biologically impossible. For instance, he claimed he could transform one species of wheat, which is a tetraploid with 28 chromosomes,
into a completely different species, a hexaploid with 42 chromosomes,
Yeah.
simply by planting the seeds in autumn for a few years.
That's impossible.
Completely impossible. Yet when the chromosome number of his wheat samples failed to align with his theory, Lysenko simply claimed that the chromosome number changed as well, defying fundamental biological fact.
So reality was just negotiated out of existence to serve the political narrative.
And the terrifying part of this history is how aggressively this dogma was enforced by the state apparatus.
This is where we see the catastrophic power of institutional capture.
Joseph Stalin himself personally supported and edited Lysenko's speeches. He used the immense political pressure of the regime to link any opposition to Lysenko's theories with active resistance to the state.
So genetics was openly and officially denounced as fascist science or bourgeois pseudoscience.
Yes, and the consequences for the scientific community, the people who tried to maintain objective rigor, were devastating.
Over 3,000 professional biologists were fired from their posts across the Soviet Union.
And numerous world-class scientists were imprisoned, exiled, or even executed, including Lysenko's own former mentor, Nikolai Vavilov, who was a globally renowned geneticist.
So genetics research was effectively annihilated in the USSR until after Stalin's death in 1953.
And the practical consequence. This ideological purification resulted in systemic famine and massive agricultural failure across the Soviet Union.
Because the farming practices mandated by Lysenko pseudoscience were biologically unsound.
Reality in the form of crop yield cannot be negotiated forever. It proves that if you place ideological loyalty above competence, reality will eventually catch up, often with brutal results for the general population.
But there is one crucial, ironic caveat in this entire historical nightmare that demonstrates the ultimate limits of ideology.
The physics exception.
Precisely. Soviet nuclear physicists were, for the most part, entirely spared from liquidation and ideological meddling.
They were allowed to continue their work based on objective, non-Marxist physics.
But why? Why the special treatment? Why was physics sacrosanct while biology was deemed bourgeois?
Because Stalin understood that successful military and technological payoffs, specifically developing the atomic bomb, required their calculations to be accurate.
If the physicists had adopted a Marxist physics and the bomb failed to detonate,
the consequences for the regime would have been immediate and catastrophic on the world stage. Their competence could not be presumed to be wrong if the state wished to maintain power and succeed technologically.
That is a staggering contrast. It implies that ideology can effectively capture fields where the consequences of being wrong are diffuse or delayed or subject to political interpretation.
Like agriculture, social policy, or maybe even ESG reporting.
But where reality imposes an immediate non-negotiable consequence like nuclear physics or the structural integrity of a bridge, competence must be retained, even if it's in secret. Otherwise, the regime fails immediately.
It forces a bifurcated system. Rigid ideological control over the soft sciences and social systems, but an enforced, often hidden adherence to objective truth in safety-critical technological or military fields.
But that dichotomy is often temporary, isn't it? Because ideological capture always leaks.
It always leaks, and that brings us directly to Section 4. The systemic consequences we are seeing today as rigor collapses across multiple modern institutions.
And this collapse of rigor isn't just happening in corporations. It's manifesting everywhere our elite professionals are trained and operate. Let's start with academia, particularly the humanities, which often acts as the ideological incubator.
We're seeing a breakdown in fundamental rigor and most worryingly, in intellectual honesty.
This shift has created an environment where the standards of intellectual integrity are just sacrificed to political expediency. I mean, the most grievous academic sin, plagiarism, which should be an absolute firing offense,
Is now being excused, redefined, and tolerated for political reasons. This was crystallized in the scandal involving something called critical plagiarism theory at a prestigious university.
The name itself sounds like a deliberate effort to rationalize dishonesty. What exactly was the institutional argument used to justify redefining clear, unambiguous plagiarism?
Well, the plagiarism was undeniable. Passages were lifted almost verbatim from other published works. But instead of accountability, the administration issued a vague statement, effectively redefining the act as merely careless cutting and pasting of other people's work.
And the core argument used by the perpetrator's allies was deeply ideological.
It was. The argument essentially posited that traditional notions of intellectual ownership and academic rigor, including citation rules, are inherently Western or white concepts.
And therefore, tools of oppression.
Therefore, tools of oppression. By copying and pasting, the argument went, the academic was actually challenging the oppressive structure of ownership and challenging the very concept of individual merit-based scholarship.
So they framed the act of plagiarism as a form of intellectual liberation rather than theft.
That is the complete inversion of academic ethics. If the traditional standards are considered inherently biased, then the only way to hold someone accountable is if they plagiarize a politically favored author.
Or if the accuser has the right political standing.
Exactly. The decision to tolerate the plagiarism was predicated on the perpetrator's protected status and the political persuasion of the accusers. If the person committing the violation represented a desired demographic and the person pointing it out was deemed politically incorrect,
The plagiarism was tolerated and excused. And that's the moment where politics, rather than merit or intellectual honesty, becomes the primary mechanism for hiring, retention, and promotion.
and the integrity of the entire academic enterprise is destroyed because the most fundamental rule is now negotiable.
This crisis of rigor extends sharply and dangerously into the scientific and public health communities. We saw this profoundly during recent public health emergencies, and it led to a massive loss of public trust.
We have to highlight the structural conflicts of interest that exist within the very bodies designed to regulate our health and research. I mean, consider the staggering fact that over a decade prior to the pandemic, employees at the NIH shared $325 million in royalties with the private pharmaceutical sector.
$325 million, that's a massive financial connection, and it fundamentally compromises trust.
It does. Regulatory bodies are responsible for evaluating and recommending drugs and policies, often based on data from private companies, while their own employees are directly benefiting financially from those same companies.
It creates an immediate severe conflict. When the regulators are financially entwined with the regulated, public trust just evaporates, and rightly so.
The public begins to suspect or outright believe that the recommendations being issued are driven by profit motives or career advancement rather than objective, pure science.
And the mission of the public health community also seemed to shift dramatically during this time. It moved away from establishing objective truth based on data to actively trying to persuade the public.
Often using highly political messaging to enforce conformity. We saw clear evidence of this shift in official policy recommendations that just lacked foundational data.
The example of universal toddler masking in the U.S. stands out.
It does. Medical professionals noted there was no robust evidence in favor of the policy. In fact, major international bodies, like the European CDC and the World Health Organization, recommended against masking young children due to developmental and compliance concerns.
Yet the U.S. public health establishment pushed the policy strongly. The goal seemed to become unanimity of messaging, prioritizing compliance and political expediency over accurate, comparative scientific discourse.
And the motivation for this intellectual conformity often comes down to funding power. The few people controlling massive grant pipelines, such as certain high-ranking officials at the NIH, hold immense leverage.
Of course, if you're a young scientist or even a seasoned researcher and you publicly contradict the consensus set by that power structure, you risk losing your grant funding.
You risk stalling your career, jeopardizing your lab's existence.
That financial and professional leverage enforces conformity, which is why those individuals controlling the grants can eventually feel empowered to declare, as some did, that they are the science.
The fear of negative career consequences turns highly educated scientists into cautious political actors rather than fearless truth seekers, regardless of what the underlying data suggests.
And moving from science to data-driven inquiry in economics, we see a similar ideological capture where data interpretation is molded to fit a preconceived political narrative.
Often ignoring uncomfortable facts. The case study of the child tax credit report error perfectly illustrates how institutions actively suppress data that contradicts their political policy goals.
So the initial report on the credit was highly publicized and supported the policy change.
It was, however, dissenting economists uncovered a significant methodological error in the report, and correcting that error revealed a major politically inconvenient consequence.
Which was?
The change would incentivize an estimated 1.5 million parents to exit the workforce due to the weakening of work requirements and other incentives.
1.5 million. So the dissenting data revealed a massive negative impact on workforce participation. What was the institutional response to this verifiable, data-backed evidence?
The institution refused to correct the public record. The political narrative promoting the credit was prioritized over accurate economic data. To officially correct the record would have complicated the legislative push, so the data was effectively suppressed through institutional inertia.
And this institutional capture often ensures that the data interpretation aligns with a preconceived narrative through filtering who even gets to speak.
That's where the selection of experts comes in. When the government assembled a policy panel to decide on the future of this credit, the selection process was profoundly skewed.
How skewed?
Of the 14 members chosen for the panel, 11 had already publicly supported the policy change being debated, and 0 had expressed dissenting evidence-based views.
0.
This demonstrates that institutional capture isn't just about suppressing truth. It's about proactively selecting only those experts whose interpretations are guaranteed to align with the desired political outcome.
That's a terrifying level of filtering. It's the appearance of expert consensus without the reality of intellectual inquiry. Finally, let's look at legal education, which acts as the gatekeepers of our institutions.
Shaping the next generation of judges, politicians, and corporate leaders. The ideological capture here is critically important.
Yes, the capture of elite law schools is profoundly worrying because these are the institutions that train the people who will run our entire system of justice and governance.
And the central beliefs animating what is often termed woke law rest on two premises that fundamentally destabilize the rule of law.
The first is the belief that hierarchies are arbitrary, not merit-based.
Correct. The foundational view is that success and wealth in society do not primarily come from effort or competence or rigorous intellectual application, but from connections, inheritance, and luck.
And if you fundamentally believe this,
then the entire legal structure, free markets, property rights, contracts, is not a system for fairness, but a system designed merely to enforce pre-existing power imbalances.
And the second premise, which is deeply relativistic, is that there is no truth, there are just truths.
This premise destroys the foundation of a liberal constitutional order. The legal system relies on individuals being able to use objective evidence and reason towards a shared societal understanding of truth.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly. If dialogue is reduced purely to a competition for one person to impose their subjective views on another, then logic, evidence, and debate are useless. It all reduces immediately to raw power dynamics.
And this leads directly to the operational outcome we've seen played out on campuses. The political project of lawfare and the radical idea that fundamental principles like free speech are merely tools of power.
That's the practical application. When students and future lawyers shout down speakers, disrupt classes, or physically intimidate federal judges, they aren't acting out of spontaneous anger. They're operating under the ideological belief that speech is violence and violence is speech.
So therefore, disrupting a dissenting voice is viewed as a legitimate, necessary form of exercising power to rebalance perceived oppression.
And the risk here is acute. Elite institutions are training a generation of professionals to view core liberal constitutional principles, like free speech, due process, and objective truth, not as the bedrock of a free society,
but as tactical weapons to be deployed against their ideological opponents, ultimately undermining the very systems they are supposed to uphold.
And with that, we've really completed the circle. We've covered the corrupted metrics of ESG and DEI, the psychological conformity driven by that fear of status loss, the terrifying historical echo of Lysenkoism, and now the systemic collapse of rigor across academia, science, economics, and law.
And to synthesize our findings, that terror my engineer friend felt watching objective safety margins disappear, it isn't an accident. It is the predictable, almost mechanistic result of institutional leadership lacking moral clarity.
where the internal motivation of professionals is driven primarily by that psychological need to appease and conform, weighted heavily by high SDO and FNE.
This internal pressure just overwhelmingly outweighs the professional responsibility to objective reality, whether that reality is physics, biology, economic data, or legal precedent.
When ideological capture occurs, competence crises are not unforeseen events. They are simply symptoms of a system that has fundamentally decided that reality is negotiable.
And the historical record, from Lysenko's failed harvests causing widespread famine to our contemporary systemic failures in infrastructure and public health, it shows the ultimate result is inevitable.
Systemic entropy and decline.
And the tragedy is that this ideological corruption doesn't just damage the internal function of the institution it targets, whether it's an engineering firm or a university.
No. As has been observed, when ideology infects an institution, academic, medical, or corporate, it actively corrupts the institution itself. It turns its purpose inward, away from objective service.
And critically, it accelerates the decline of society itself.
Which makes the fight for objective rigor, for truth, for merit, and for the simple acknowledgement that physics is not a bias, not merely an academic debate.
It's a fundamental fight for the durability of our civilization.